Let's continue with the fun here by diving into psychoanalytic, psychodynamic theories of personality. And buckle up because we are going to look at some very interesting ideas that Freud had. So, Freud is famous for his psychoanalytic approach to thought, emotion, and behavior and personality. And Freud came of age during the Victorian era, which was a time of tremendous discovery and scientific achievement, but also, unfortunately, a time of really intense sexual repression and male dominance. And these ideas influenced Freud's ideas about personality, the role of women in society, all of these types of things. So in the late 1800s, Freud set up a private practice specializing in what he called nervous disorders. Today, we would say that that looks a lot like anxiety. And eventually, he started looking for the psychological causes of the anxious behaviors that Freud was noticing, particularly in women. And I will tell you what, if you were a woman in the late 1800s, you might have felt nervous too because you really didn't have a very high place in society. But of course, rather than look at the systems that might have put that into place, Freud immediately looked at the person himself and started trying to analyze why would they be feeling this way? Why would they have these anxious behaviors? So, Freud's theory of personality really attributes thoughts and actions to unconscious motives and conflicts. We've talked about this before. And his approach, psychoanalysis, refers to techniques that he used to treat what he considered to be psychological disorders, really by seeking to expose and interpret people's unconscious tensions, he called them. His method for doing that was called free association. And free association is basically where a therapist invites you to lay down on a couch, close your eyes, and then immediately just start talking about whatever pops into your mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing. You guys know where you've had times where some random thought pops into your head that you would never say out loud. Freud would be like, just say it all out loud. Let's try to make sense of it. It's probably your unconscious trying to tell us something. So let's talk about consciousness and Freud's iceberg analogy. So Freud is very famous for the diagram that you see to the left there, and he talks about our mind being split into consciousness and unconsciousness. He says our conscious awareness floats above the surface. Like imagine your mind is an iceberg. Just a little tip of the iceberg floats above the surface. And he meant the surface that's observable to other people. And so Freud would say there's really only a tiny little bit of ourselves that we have direct control over that's available to us and others in terms of direct observation. But beneath that surface, he said, is this larger unconscious mind that contains thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories, a lot of which contains sexual desires, aggressive motivations, and things that we would consider to be quote unquote socially inappropriate. So Freud felt like a lot of people, as they live their life, shoved down into the unconscious all of these inappropriate thoughts that would be too unsettling to acknowledge directly. But they don't always stay down there. They slip out in different ways, and then they might affect our behaviors that we're doing. Okay, so according to Freud, nothing is ever on accident. Everything that's seemingly random that somebody says or does that we can't make a lot of sense of, he would say comes from our unconscious. He's famous for talking about slips of the tongue. Your book has some amazing examples of those. He would say any sort of inappropriate joke is some sort of release of all of this tension that we're shoving down into our conscious. And he even, if you remember in our sleep and dreaming section, has this dream theory where he says our dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, that as we sleep, information from our unconscious is coming out to affect our dreams in meaningful ways. Let's talk a little bit more about Freud's theory in general. In addition to the iceberg theory, Freud is also famous for distinguishing between the id, the ego, and the superego. So before we even dive into this, you guys, I like to think of the id as the little devil on your shoulder who's constantly telling you to immediately gratify yourself or engage in the wrong thing to do. And your superego is like the little angel on your shoulder that's always telling you to do the right thing and so on and so forth. And then your ego, I just like to think of that as your brain. Your ego is constantly trying to satisfy the demands of your id while helping you be the person you want to be through your superego. So let's dive into this a little bit. According to Freud, we all have an id, and your id is basically this drive to satisfy any of your base urges in life. Your id operates according to the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification. So, your little inner wild child, let's say. Again, your superego, then the opposite, represents all of your internalized ideals, who you actually want to be, the best possible version of yourself. It provides standards for your judgment and for future aspirations, and it's always telling you, hold on a second, let's act according to what our philosophical and spiritual ideals are telling us is best to do. And then your ego is kind of like the CEO, right? It's your brain, it's the part of your personality that's trying to mediate these things. It's grounded in reality, and it's trying to help you just be a practical grown up to the extent possible while also getting your needs met. So let's say that it's Friday night and you have an enormous test on Monday morning that's worth a huge amount of your grade, and you don't have any time to study on Saturday and Sunday. So the only time you have to study is on Friday night. Your id is like, don't study, go do something fun, go watch TV, go to the party, go to the movies, whatever. Your super ego is like, no, I really need to study, even though I don't want to, I should make myself. And then your ego is the one that's eventually gonna make a decision based on that input from those two parties. And Freud talked about how some of us throughout life, no matter how old we are very id driven, while others of us are very super ego driven. Okay, Freud is also very famous for his psychosexual stages, which I do need to preface to you have absolutely no basis in sound psychological research. But Freud truly believed that your personality forms during the first few years of your life, and that all children pass through a series of what he called psychosexual stages during which the id's pleasure seeking energies focus on distinct pleasure sensitive areas of the body that he called erogenous zones. And so I am compelled to tell you about this theory because it does show up on the AP exam itself. However, nobody believes that this is actually a thing anymore. It's just so out there that everybody continues to share what it is with the world, because this was a huge foundational component of Freud's initial psychoanalytic approach to personality. So, according to Freud, from 0 to 18 months, infants are in the oral stage. And it is true that babies put a lot of things in their mouth. Other psychologists would say that babies put a lot of things in their mouth because they're just trying to explore the world around them and make sense of it. But Freud would say that babies put things in their mouth because there are pleasure centers in the mouth that are stimulated by sucking, biting, and chewing objects. And Freud literally believed then that babies were erogenously stimulated by doing this and that that's why they were doing it. And Freud felt like if you're overly stimulated in that particular zone, that can lead to specific adult personality behaviors, or if you're understimulated in a particular zone, that could lead to particular adult personality behaviors. For real, I am not joking. All right, the next stage is the anal stage from 18 months to about 3 years old. And Freud said this is where developing children focus pleasure on bowel and bladder elimination, and that they're kind of coping with demands for control as they're working through potty training and other types of things like that. If you guys have ever heard that term anal retentive, like, oh, they're so anal retentive, they're so uptight, they're overly organized, like that type of a thing, this is where that phrase comes from. So again, he would say that if you're overly or underly stimulated in a particular area, that's going to lead to adult personality characteristics. From 3 to 6 years, according to Freud, kids are in the phallic stage where they're discovering their own genitals and kind of working through some of those types of things that kids that are overly stimulated during that time. Again, that leads to adult personality characteristics. Or if they're understimulated, then that would lead to adult personality characteristics. Then Freud said from around 6 to puberty, there's just not a lot going on. Kids are going to school, they're trying to figure out who they are as citizens, and so things kind of calm down a little bit until puberty hits. And then Freud would say from that stage on, you're in the genital period. And again, all of these things are linked to personality characteristics, according to Freud's theory. Very fascinating, absolutely zero research to back it up. Couple other terms related to Freud's psychosexual stage theory. He talks about an Oedipus complex, which I'm sure you've heard in pop culture or other classes. And this is where, according to Freud, during the phallic stage, a boy unconsciously has sexual desires for his mother, and that makes him feel jealousy and a hatred for his father. He almost sees his father as a rival for his mother's love and attention. He said the opposite applies to girls. So clearly, he was only focused on cisgender existence in this particular theory. But he said that similarly, girls developed feelings for their fathers and then had a rivalry with their mothers. He called that the Electra complex. Identification is also part of this theory. So, according to Freud, kids incorporate their parents' identities into their developing superegos, where they feel like, your parents constantly put pressure on you to be a certain way. Might as well just do it so I don't have to deal with them. Really similar to the idea of identity foreclosure that we talked about before. And then fixations. Freud would say a lingering focus of pleasure seeking at any particular area would lead to those adult personality conflicts or I'm sorry, adult personality characteristics because of unresolved conflict around this theory. Freud also talked about defense mechanisms. So he said that individuals use defense mechanisms or unconscious methods employed by our ego that help us reduce anxiety in the moment that's caused from either unacceptable thoughts coming into our head or an unacceptable version of reality that's threatening to us in some way. These methods allow us to convince ourselves that nothing's wrong so that we can avoid coming face to face with conflicts or other shameful situations that are going to cause us pain. And so a lot of people do believe that human beings employ defense mechanisms. This is the one part of Freud's theory. I think this is fascinating, and I see people employ defense mechanisms all the time. So I'm excited to know what your personal examples of these are going to be. Um, but many people would say these are actually healthy if they're used in moderation. But if they're used excessively, they result in stress and they don't help us effectively cope with reality in the long run. So, our next section, we're going to go through these common defense mechanisms according to Freud, and we'll give you some real life examples. I would love for you to think of a new example to put into the chart based on something that's sticking out to you in your own particular life. So we're going to start with repression. Freud said that we repress when we push unacceptable thoughts and feelings out of our conscious awareness. It's almost like this form of psychological forgetting. So the example would be unknowingly blocking unwanted feelings of jealousy toward your best friend's academic success. Maybe they get into a college that you wanted to go to and you don't get in, and you can't necessarily cope with that directly. You don't want to have those feelings of jealousy toward your best friend. So you shove that down so far into your unconscious, almost to the point that you forget they're even going there. Okay. Regression. Regression is when we return to an earlier or comforting form of behavior, almost reverting to childlike behavior as a way to soothe ourselves when we're faced with an uncomfortable reality. So, this could look like throwing a temper tantrum during an especially stressful period of your adult life. I literally, you guys, this is embarrassing. I threw an adult temper tantrum the other day. I got home from working a 12-hour day and all of my family's stuff was just everywhere, all over the house. And I just lost it. I just started yelling at everybody. I'm like, why don't you respect me? Why don't you pick up your stuff? Why don't you put your laundry where it goes? Definitely threw an adult temper tantrum because I was just exhausted and overwhelmed. Maybe an example in your own life would be If you get in a fight with your parents and normally you have a lot of self-control and you're willing to listen to what they have to say, but you just run up to your room and slam the door or something like that. Okay. Reaction formation. Reaction formation is when we express the exact opposite of how we actually feel on the inside. So maybe you feel guilty about illegally downloading movies from the internet, and so you join a group to promote awareness to stop it. But really, you keep on downloading illegal movies from the internet. And so you're conflicted, right? The thing that you're doing on the inside is making you feel badly. So on the outside, you act completely in the opposite way, and you're in this state of tension. Projection. So, projection happens when we falsely and unconsciously attribute our own unacceptable thoughts and feelings to other people in the world around us. So, maybe you've cheated a whole bunch of times in your school life and you don't feel that good about that, but rather than taking responsibility for your own behavior, you're just like, oh, that person's a cheater. That person's a cheater. Look at all the cheaters around me. And so the thing that you don't like about yourself, you're projecting that thing onto the people around you. Okay, rationalization is the most common defense mechanism, and this is when we basically just try to come up with an excuse for the behavior that we're doing. So, deciding that procrastination actually leads to better essays when you decide to put off your work until the last minute. That's not true for almost any human being, but you're like, you know what? I think I write better when I do that as a way to justify that to yourself. Couple more. Displacement is when we redirect our feelings toward another person or object. So it's redirecting feelings that you actually want to express toward one person or object, but for whatever reason, you're not allowed to do that. It's not socially appropriate. And so instead, you take those feelings and you displace them onto another undeserving entity. So let's say you get in a huge fight with your best friend and you're actually really angry with them, but there's stuff you can't say to them because you don't feel like it's going to be appropriate. So you're just in a terrible mood. And then the next interaction you have, you happen to be shopping, you just lay into a sales clerk when really you're not mad at them. You're mad at your friend. That would be an example. Or, for example, um, let's say your boss comes and tells you some horrible information. You're super upset with your boss. You can't yell at your boss. You might get fired. So instead, you come home and yell at your husband or yell at your wife or something like that. You might have a similar example in your own life. Maybe you're experiencing friend drama at school, and instead of being able to resolve that there, you come home and just take it out on your parents instead because they're a safe space for you. Couple more here. Sublimation is channeling your frustration toward a different goal. This is actually the one positive defense mechanism. It's basically like you're trying to pour all your effort and energy into something that's not going very well for you. So you decide to pause and look for a more healthy outlet for that thing instead. So maybe you're working so hard on a homework assignment and you're just not getting anywhere. And instead, you decide to take a break and go channel all that energy into a really tough workout to clear your mind. Or let's say that there's little kids who just love to knock other people down and tackle them. That's not socially appropriate. You can't do that at recess. But if you channel that energy into football practice, then now all of a sudden that's totally socially appropriate. And you might even get praised for tackling people and knocking them down. And then lastly, denial. You guys have all heard of this one. This is just where you literally refuse to acknowledge a painful reality because it's too hurtful for you to do so. So if you're addicted to smoking, if you disregard scientific evidence that smoking increases your risk of lung cancer and you keep buying cigarettes and smoking them, you are in denial. We're going to go ahead and pause the video here. I know we just went through defense mechanisms really quickly, and as you look at applied examples in life, sometimes they can start to blend together a little bit for you. So what I would love for you to do is to spend time trying to identify for each example that you see there, which is the accurate defense mechanism that describes that. Do your best effort. I'm going to go ahead and grade this portion on completion, and then when we come back together next time, we'll go through the correct answers because this is really similar to what you would see on the AP exam itself. We want to be able not only to understand what is that defense mechanism, but how do we see that playing out in applied real world examples? Almost done here. A couple criticisms of Freud. One is that his theory is literally utterly unscientific. He places this huge emphasis on childhood, and his theory is really deterministic. It's like whatever happens to you in childhood just determines how your personality is going to be for the rest of your life. It's not testable. A lot of his research was done, like I told you, on women and women with emotional problems. And then he just applied those findings to everybody across the whole wide world, which is absolutely inappropriate to do. He doesn't establish causal relationships, and he definitely doesn't have a representative sample of folks. And you can see some of the other criticisms there as well. We're going to end up by giving you just a couple of minutes to explore these key psychodynamic psychologists on your own. So, we're going to look at Young, Horney, Karen Horney, and Adler in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to let you do that independently. So just take a couple of minutes to move through the rest of the slides that are linked with this interactive notebook. Take a peek at these major contributions, and we will look at those together in class next time. And I look forward to seeing you then.